What is narrative? It's a simple question. Everybody's talking about what's his story, what's going on, what kind of a tale is he trying to tell us? It's like a bill of goods you're trying to sell in the real world. And you hear newscasters all the time talk about narrative like, well, he's trying to take control of the narrative, okay? But nobody ever says what the narrative is. What is narrative? Well, at first you might think that narrative is just simply story. And in a sense, that's true, but story has a lot more than narrative in it. For example, narrative can be seen as kind of the DNA of the story that are the instructions for how it creates the skeleton of the story at a mechanical level. Just like it has joints and it has bones and tendons, all this stuff is created by the genome of story, which is the narrative. And then it implements itself as that underlying structure in a story. But after that, then you have to put clothes on it once you've got the physical being completely created, the story as it were, if it were a person. And so you clothe it with your storytelling, which is your subject matter. Okay, you add all of these interesting places and you are dealing with these subjects. Interesting thing about narrative that is pretty much understood by all people who study it is that narrative itself, the structure, is transportable from one medium to another, from one story to another, because it's just the basic instructions for building that skeleton. But then, once you have all of the flesh on it, and then you clothe it in your subject matter, and then you use your style as an author to give it life, to give it personality, to describe how it moves and what it's interested in and whether it's a practical joker or likes to tell mysteries, thinking of your story as a person. Well, that's what narrative is in fiction. But it goes beyond fiction. What is narrative in the real world? Well, in the real world, we have our own psychology as individuals. And in fact, as we'll see throughout this series of programs, we think in a narrative structure. If you use the same narrative structure that evolved in stories in order to satisfy our need to understand what's going on and what its meaning is, well, that very same narrative structure is there in stories because it's how we think. It's simply a reflection, an external manifestation of how we think within our own minds. It's because we all share this narrative framework by which we parse our world and say, is this important, is it not? What context should we put it in? Should we understand if it's good or bad through our perspective or through the eyes of the person who we're looking at or the people we're looking at? All of that is the psychology of narrative. And it doesn't stop there either. Because just as an individual organizes his mind automatically, or her mind, by narrative, when we get together in groups towards common purpose, we tend to form a narrative structure to the way the group is formed, with different people emerging as different facets that we have within our own minds. So there'll be a voice of reason within a group, there'll be a resident skeptic, there'll be somebody who speaks for the humanity and with passion and emotion. All of these things are qualities we have within ourselves that we use all the time. But when we get together in groups towards common purpose, we form a group identity in which we each, in addition to being individuals with our own concerns, in regard to the group's concerns, we all play a role much like characters play in a story. So that's the third level up from fiction to psychology of the individual to sociology and dealing with how, as a group, we function in a narrative form. But there's one more level that we found after 30 some odd years of studying this, myself and my co-creator of the theory, Chris Huntley. What we discovered was that the patterns that we see are the same way you'd see a spiral in a teacup or a spiral in a galaxy. We're not saying that a teacup is the same thing as a galaxy. What we're saying is that the spiral pattern is an essential pattern for our minds. We recognize it, and we learn something about how the tea in a teacup is working. The same way we look at a galaxy and understand almost intuitively how that spiral shape is working. So we have these basic forms that come out of narrative, the spirals, the circles. For example, one way you might look at narrative is you might look at a finished story. And when you do, you see this item, this object. It's not in motion. Things aren't happening. It's all said and done. You've seen the story, if you're an audience, and you say, I understand what this story is, what it's about, what all the pieces are, how they fit together. Like a Christmas Carol or something. You get it. You understand that story. But that's not the same as the pathway you take getting to that story. And the pathway that you take getting there is linear, temporal. It moves along as things are revealed and unfolded. And the order in which things happen has meaning. For example, a slap followed by a scream, ah, okay, is a lot different in meaning than a scream, ah, followed by a slap. In the first case, the person's reacting, more coffee, hold on. A little run in it this morning. In the first case, the person is reacting to being slapped. Ah! Okay, in the second case, the person is maybe hysterical, and the slap brings them to their senses. Ah! Okay, so the order in which things happen creates meaning. And then there's the order in which it's revealed, which is all storytelling. Do we show it in the order that it happened, or do we move things around a little bit? There's a great example in a movie called Pulp Fiction by Quentin Tarantino. If you check that one out, all the stories, and there's several of them in it, they all are presented out of order. And your job as an audience is to try and figure out what order did those actually occur in, and therefore you can't get the meaning until you understand the temporal progression. So, as a result of dealing with temporal progression and the spatial understanding, it's a lot like DNA. Think about it. Rosalind, I can never remember her last name, who was the, I should, it's important, who was the one who did X-ray crystallography, where she, before Crick and Watson got a hold of DNA, she studied DNA from X-ray photography. And when you study it in X-ray, it appears to be a crystal. DNA is not a double helix. It appears to be a crystal under X-ray light when you photograph it. And so that's what stories are, is they're like that crystalline form where you say, here are all the pieces and here how they're stuck together. But when you tell the story over time, okay, then you're looking at the DNA of story. You're looking at the double helix. What we discovered in our modeling of story, and we did model it, in fact we got a patent for our model, and it later became the engine that drives Dramatica story structuring software that can predict where structure needs to go based on choices that you've already made. If you want to know more about any of this stuff, look in the description down below. I got all kinds of links to the information and also to software products and things. Lots of good stuff for writers and other people who are just interested in narrative. But if you look at it at the DNA with a double helix, it turns out in stories, narrative is actually a quad helix. There's two double helixes that helix around each other, and that was necessary in order to be able to include time in the equation, because time, the order in which things happen, is so important to narrative. Now, that carries us into the science part, where we're looking at that spiral in the galaxy. We're looking at DNA in its crystalline form and its temporal form. As a matter of fact, one way to think about story structure, narrative, whether it's in fiction or whether it's in the real world, is that it's sort of like a Rubik's Cube. All narrative structures have the same pieces. There's always going to be a voice of reason. There's always going to be a skeptic. There's always going to be these perspectives. There's always going to be these questions that come up. The same ones. What changes is the way they relate to another. Just like with a Rubik's Cube, it only has 27 little cubes in it. 3 rows of 9. Each side only has 9 on it, and there's 3 rows. 27 cubes, and yet it creates something like 40 trillion combinations of colors, different patterns. Some of them vastly different, and some of them were just a couple of things are changed. But there's 40 trillion of them. Well, that's how story structure works. The same small number of pieces that we all recognize that lead us to have a hero, that lead us to have a plot twist, a midway point, that lead us to have a certain number of acts and a certain number of scenes, that something around that feels like you're zeroing in on the proper mix. All of that comes innately from our own narrative minds, and then ultimately it's presented in narrative structure in fiction, or when we're trying to understand ourselves using narrative, when we are trying to understand what's going on in the world, which is using it society, and ultimately when we're trying to say, can we learn something more about how to best look at the physical world so that we see it through our narrative eyes, because if we're not doing it that way, we're not getting the clearest view of how things work, even in physics. Now, I'll give you a couple things here at the end. I think I've spoken enough for this particular first session. I hope it gives you a taste for the general ideas of what we're going to be covering, but we're going to start in the next section with a very simple basics. We don't want anything that's very complicated. We're going to stick to fiction only in the next one with the most fundamental ideas so that we have some basic building blocks from which to build our understandings later. Okay, now a little bit about who I am. I'm Melanie Ann Phillips. I'm the co-creator of the Dramatica Theory of Story. We published our book called Dramatica, A New Theory of Story back in 1991, Chris Huntley and I, and it was based on our work we'd already done for a while to try and understand a new way of looking at story rather than the traditional way of saying, here are these points, these archetypes, these, a hero's journey. We wanted to take a different approach and say, where does narrative come from? And how does it reflect our psychology? Why do stories work? And can we find those patterns in story? We have an airplane going by. I want to ask your tolerance and forgiveness for that, because my studio is right under the flight path, and in addition I have to have the door open in order to get enough light in here to record. But remember, this is just a casual exploration of my life's work, a third of a century studying, modeling, and then trying to find ways of implementing and putting narrative to work. And that's what you'll find here. So again, our work has been successful. More than 100,000 writers from all over the world, including, as I've said in other videos, there's Academy Award winners and New York Times bestsellers, and even one Pulitzer Prize winner who is a big fan of our work and uses it all the time. Hundreds of thousands of people use the concepts, and well over 100,000 people have used the Dramatica software to structure their novels, screenplays, stage plays, even short stories, and there's material on that. Over the years, I've created, starting back in 1999, videos, which were some of the first videos that were created for the web, webcasts. It was like within the first few months of being able to do that. And I created a series of 113 videos that ran for like 20 hours in order to document where we were then. But our understanding after that, 1999 to now, which is, 20 some odd years later, almost a fourth of a century, our understanding has gotten much deeper, and our work has gotten more important, because for about 10-year span there, we were helping the NSA, the CIA, and the NRO to use narrative to understand terrorists and determine what they were thinking, where they were coming from, in ways they may not have even been able to understand about themselves, and then to project what their likely action was, and to look for trigger points in lone wolf terrorists that could let you know, here are the red flags from a narrative standpoint. That was really interesting work. Even did it with unfriendly competing nations to get a grip on what their real agenda was, not through the eyes of our Western culture, but through the culturally agnostic eyes of the story structure, the narrative structure behind it, and then to project even what-if scenarios. How about if we did this or created that kind of an impression? What impact would it have on these terrorists or these other nations, and how might they respond? So it's gone lots of places, and this is getting, pretty long. So I'm going to call it to a close now. You have a general idea of what I'm going to be talking about. And again, casual discussion, no particular agenda. Each time I come on, I'm going to be just describing some other interesting aspect of narrative, and you can tune out whenever you want. I'll try to put up a title that is indicative of what I'm covering in that first episode or each episode. That's about it. Nowhere else to go from here except to hit the little red button and have some more coffee.